First, our top story of the day is going to focus around a couple of maritime issues, one around the Panama Canal, and the other being the health of a major maritime carrier. Greg Miller is going to join us now to fill us in. Greg, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me.
So, Greg, we've known about issues with the Panama Canal for a while now, and the backup is enormous. So, what's the situation right now, and how is it affecting maritime shipping?
Yeah, it's not so much a backup as it is the Panama Canal. It needs to conserve water. It desperately needs to conserve water. It didn't get enough rain during the rainy season. It's going into the dry season. It needs to keep the draft at 44 feet. It can't let it go down further. So it needs to reduce the number of reserve transits per day to conserve water. And that's going to be a big problem for shipping. I mean, we didn't know how big of a problem it was this summer. Now we know. And so the restrictions on the reservation slots that they announced early this month, coming into effect through February, basically cut the number of Neo-Panamax transits, the larger ships, in half, from 10 to 5 as of February 1st. And that's going to be a big deal. I mean, essentially, if you look at the average number of Neo-Panamax container ships that have used the larger locks over the last 2 fiscal years, it's 5. So, and that's an average. So, starting in February, there are going to be scheduling problems for container ships, and there are going to be. It's going to push out the very large propane carrier vessels and the LNG ships, and that's going to cause all sorts of problems as well.
And Greg, when we're looking at what's going on with the Panama Canal, I can only start to think about where we've come from, of course, throughout the pandemic, then a huge queue of ships on the West Coast, everything trying to get into the U.S. Now, there seems to be a leveling off. Inventory levels are starting to moderate, and maybe the appetite to rush things to the U.S. aren't as high. Are we seeing any kind of changes in the mindset when we're looking at what shippers are doing now, and how are they reacting overall?
Well, I mean, clearly, if you look at what's going on in the Panama Canal, you need to plan for this. And there's a solution. It's called the West Coast. You could just go back to Los Angeles and Long Beach. LA Long Beach is underutilized. There's plenty of space. You can pop right over there. There's an established logistics network to get containers from LA Long Beach over to the East Coast via intermodal or even trucks. So you can just switch back to the way you used to do it. And we are, starting to hear of shippers making that decision because they're looking at what's happening here and they're seeing that come next year, the dry season's coming. So it could get even worse. If the Panama Canal has to lower the draft even further, that's going to cause even more problems for container ships and for everybody else. They're going to have to unload more boxes before they go through the canal. So it makes sense to plan ahead and really rethink, why not the West Coast? And they're doing it.
So looking at that, last year in terms of obviously the Panama Canal had enough rainfall, they were able to sustain a large amount of ships that of course were coming through because of labor issues on the West Coast, moving to the East Coast. Is the windfall that the East Coast saw last year basically wiped out because of what's going on now that LA Long Beach is open and the Panama Canal is obviously seeing its difficulty in not having enough water?
I mean, these things take time. So, the changes are sticky. I mean, when people moved to the East Coast, they opened up new DCs and, put a whole new system in place. So it's not like you can turn on a dime, but it is, and it does make, in general, it makes more sense for shippers to go to the East Coast because most of the population is east of the Mississippi. So, it makes more sense to do it that way. But this is going to shift the pendulum back again. So part of that's going to come back to the West Coast, and then of course we have the rising threat of the East and Gulf Coast, potential strike next November. So people are starting to plan for that too. So it is starting to shift a bit more back to the West Coast. It's fine.
And Greg, besides the West Coast, are there any other route changes? I know Suez may be a possibility, or maybe just rerouting altogether. What is that starting to look like, and where is that traffic on that canal?
Yeah, there are already ships that come over from Asia through the Suez. They go through the Mediterranean. They come in. Some of them go to the Freeport container ship, transshipment hub in the Bahamas. Larger ships coming through, and we have heard various container lines say that we may have to reconsider the Asia East Coast route through the Panama Canal, and put ships instead through the Suez Canal, which they can do. I mean, the only difference between going one route versus the other is you need you need more ships to do the Suez Canal because it's a longer route. And if there's one thing that container lines have is they have a lot of ships. They have too many ships, so they can actually address some of the overcapacity by creating strings of services through the Suez Canal with more ships, and do it that way.
So let's shift gears to the health of one of those carriers, Zim, and obviously they had their earnings report not too recently, or very recently, and some very interesting numbers. Obviously, they've got more than one kind of basket to fill in terms of who they're serving at this point. But what do you make of what you saw to Zim losing billions of dollars year over year?
Yeah, when you see that headline the other day, Zim net loss for the third quarter of $2.27 billion, you ask yourself, how is it possible for Zim or any container line to lose $2.27 billion in a single quarter? And the answer was that was almost entirely a $2 billion plus non-cash impairment charge. So that's non-cash. Zim still has $3.1 billion in cash, has plenty of cash. In terms of actual net losses, unrelated to the accounting issue, they lost about $207 million in the third quarter, which is slightly less bad than the $213 million they lost in the second quarter. The issue of the impairment is that when people take an impairment like that, what they're saying is they're throwing in the towel on their near-term hopes. They're taking, they're bringing down the value of their assets on their balance sheet, and then they're reflecting it in their operating statement. So what they're saying is they don't see a recovery in 2024. They're pinning their hopes on a recovery in 2025, and join the crowd. Maersk said the same thing. So did Hapag-Lloyd. So the hopes are pretty much gone for a big recovery for container lines in 2024. They think there's going to be overcapacity.
And when we're looking at the situation, you mentioned there's another maritime shipper that's looking at somewhat of the same. What are going to be the overall outlooks, as you mentioned, going into 2024 and throughout the year? Of course, not as much volumes expected throughout the midst of the pandemic, always the constant comparison. But what are going to be some of the overall maritime expectations going into, of course, the first quarter of 2024 and maybe some further outlooks throughout the year?
Well, the problem really hasn't been volume, and actually volume this year, although, I mean, if you look at the COVID era, of course, it looks terrible. But really, if you look back to the normal years, we're up single digits from 18 and 19. And people do expect, a modest recovery in volumes in 2024 versus 2023. So it's really not so much the volume issue, although if we have this recession finally, there could be a volume issue. Really, the problem is there's too much capacity on the water. Basically, the shipping lines have all of these leased older ships, and they have all these new ships coming in. And there's an overlap between the leases on the old ships and the arrival of the new ships. As soon as the leases on the old ships end, they can give them back and take the new ships. But there's an overlap. And so there's going to be an overlap in 24 and 25. And it's going to make it complicated for them to pull back on the capacity in the way they really need to. So there's going to be too much capacity and rates are going to be low. So shippers should expect another nice year in terms of, relatively cheap import rates because of this overcapacity issue.
Certainly, definitely a changing world in maritime almost on the daily. As you have, of course, geopolitical events, you've got weather events, and you've got everything else heading up and trying to get out of this tough recessionary period here in maritime. Greg, thanks so much for joining us.
Sure, anytime.